We know, as Melanie just said, we know that the world has changed and that Canada must change with it. Realizing Canada's full potential as an energy superpower and striking new international agreements with reliable partners.
Canada leads new global anti-Trump trade alliance to fight back on tariffs, and Washington never saw it coming. While President Donald Trump escalates yet another round of unpredictable tariffs and forces allies into economic whiplash, Prime Minister Mark Carney is quietly assembling a trade coalition so large and so coordinated that it fundamentally rewrites the rules of global commerce. And here's the part that changes everything. The United States is no longer at the center of the system. In fact, it's not even invited into the room where this new order is being designed. This isn't a negotiation, it's a realignment, and Carney is the one drawing the map.
In early 2026, a perfect storm began forming around two forces. On one side, Trump unveiled a new plan to impose a 15% tariff on global imports after his earlier tariff program was struck down in court. The move intensified the sense of instability that has come to define American trade policy, leaving partners unsure whether tariffs will rise, fall, or be rewritten again within weeks. Governments across Europe and Asia froze decisions, postponed deals, and looked for alternatives that did not depend on Washington's volatility. On the other side of that storm stood Canada. Carney's government stepped directly into the vacuum and began coordinating a system that could protect supply chains from precisely this kind of uncertainty. Canada is now leading discussions between the European Union and the 12-nation CPTPP bloc, which includes Japan, Australia, Vietnam, Singapore, Mexico, and others. The goal is not a traditional free trade agreement, but something more tactical and more powerful. A unified rules of origins pact allowing goods to move across nearly 40 countries as if they were produced inside a single integrated market. Carney has already dispatched his envoy to Singapore, sent his trade minister to Vietnam, and positioned Canada as the bridge between Europe and the Indo-Pacific. The effect is enormous. If finalized, the pact connects a market of 1.5 billion consumers and insulates participants from unilateral American tariffs. Canada is no longer reacting to U.S. policy. Canada is now shaping the alternative.
Trump's tariff strategy was designed to pressure countries individually. Instead, it pushed them into collective action. For years, partners have watched the U.S. introduce tariffs overnight, withdraw them under legal pressure, and then reintroduce different ones under another statute. No industry can plan investments when the rules shift with every speech or court ruling. What emerged was a global desire for predictability and rules-based fairness, something Washington once provided but no longer guarantees. Carney's message, delivered repeatedly on the world stage, resonated quickly. If the United States abandons the rules-based trade architecture, middle powers must rebuild it themselves. That message is now becoming a blueprint.
The EU and CPTPP have very different political cultures, regulatory expectations, and negotiation traditions. In most eras, these regions would not naturally converge. Yet Canada occupies a unique position, a comprehensive trade agreement already in force with Europe, founding membership in the Pacific Partnership, and a governance model known for reliability and low geopolitical baggage. Carney's personal credibility, built from years of economic stewardship, adds an extra layer of confidence. For both sides, Canada is the safest and most neutral convener, the country that can represent the interests of democracies without risking dominance over the group. This trust is political capital, and Carney is spending it strategically.
At major global gatherings this year, the shift was undeniable. American officials found themselves defending policy rather than leading it. Allies expressed concern over the unpredictability of U.S. tariffs and the inability of Washington to commit to stable, long-term frameworks. Meanwhile, Canada, once overshadowed in these settings, emerged with a coherent vision and a coalition ready to listen. This is not hostility toward the United States. It is exhaustion. The world is tired of governing its economies around the fluctuations of American domestic politics. Countries are making a pragmatic decision: reduce exposure, diversify partners, and rely on nations that can provide steady leadership. Canada fits that description far better than the United States in the current climate.
If the Rules of Origin Pact is completed, manufacturers immediately gain the ability to reorganize supply chains around a predictable supernetwork. A Canadian battery assembled with Japanese components and Australian minerals could enter Europe tariff-free, even if the US attempts to impose a 30% duty on all three countries. That advantage compounds across industries. Automotive firms could save hundreds of millions each year by routing production through this corridor rather than risking sudden tariff spikes in the United States. Investment decisions would shift as well. Companies seeking certainty would expand operations in Canada to secure access to the bloc. From aerospace suppliers in Montreal to agriculture processors in the prairies, Canadian industries would become gateways to the world's most stable trade ecosystem.
Trump's entire tariff strategy is built on the assumption that the U.S. remains the indispensable global market. If 40 countries integrate their supply chains without America, that assumption collapses. Canadian exporters will be able to import components from multiple countries without penalty, while U.S. manufacturers face higher costs for the same goods. Global buyers will shift contracts toward Canada because it offers stability rather than political risk. Trade influence drains gradually but decisively. Over time, Washington would lose negotiating leverage simply because the world no longer needs American market access as urgently as before. Another factor accelerating this shift is the raw economic scale behind Canada's coalition. The combined GDP of the EU and CPTPP surpasses US $35 trillion, more than one-third of the global economy. If even a fraction of their internal trade is reorganized under a unified rules of origin system, analysts estimate that participating countries could save between US $80 to $120 billion annually in avoided tariffs and compliance costs. For Canada alone, rerouting just 5% of export traffic into this tariff-proof network would unlock billions in new manufacturing investment. That scale makes Trump's tariff threats far less intimidating and explains why momentum behind Carney's plan is growing so quickly.
Trump wanted a world reshaped around bilateral deals and tariff leverage. Instead, he triggered a global coalition designed specifically to bypass the United States. And at the center of that coalition is Canada, once a quiet participant, now a strategic engineer. A 1.5 billion-person trade corridor built without Washington is not just an economic development, it is a geopolitical statement. The world can move forward without waiting for U.S. approval. So the question now is this: if Canada and its partners can build a rules-based trading system that is more stable, more predictable, and more attractive than what the United States currently offers, what role will America play in the next decade of global commerce? Because for the first time in a long time, the answer is no longer automatic.
We had a good update from Minister LeBlanc. He just gave us a bit the state of play in the way that, things are complex. I think Canadians have understood that. But also looking what happened with our colleagues in Mexico, the discussion in the United States. I mean, the focus today was really to see what's coming, but also to focus on what we can control.
Canada's finance minister just sent Washington a message it didn't expect. Trade talks under CUSMA are still ongoing, but Canada is no longer structuring its future around American unpredictability. While Donald Trump publicly claims he's ending trade negotiations, Ottawa is quietly doing something far more consequential. It is preparing for a world where U.S. volatility is no longer Canada's defining risk. This is not a moment of panic. It is a moment of recalibration.
This week, Canada's Finance Minister, François-Philippe Champagne, confirmed that discussions under USMA, the North American Trade Agreement, are continuing with the United States. His remarks followed high-level meetings with provincial finance ministers, the Bank of Canada, and Canada's trade leadership, all focused on preparing for the mandatory USMA review scheduled for 2026. The timing matters. Donald Trump is now in his second term as U.S. president, once again turning trade policy into a political weapon. Washington has floated ideas ranging from sector-by-sector agreements to openly questioning whether USMA should even survive in its current form. Public statements from the White House suggest trade talks are over, even as behind-the-scenes conversations continue. Champagne's message was deliberately calm. Canada understands the environment it is operating in. The United States is unpredictable. Policy signals change quickly, and negotiations increasingly play out in public rather than through quiet diplomacy. The question is no longer whether Canada can control U.S. behavior. The question is how Canada insulates itself from it.
The contrast between Ottawa and Washington could not be clearer. Trump governs trade through shock. Canada governs trade through preparation. Champagne openly acknowledged what Canadian officials no longer pretend otherwise. Canada cannot control policy south of the border. Under Trump, tariffs appear and disappear without warning. Long-standing agreements are treated as leverage rather than commitments. Political theater often replaces economic logic. But instead of reacting to every threat, Canada has chosen to slow the game down. Champagne emphasized that roughly 85% of Canada-US trade remains exempt under USMA, giving Canada the lowest effective cost of entry into the US market among major trading partners. That is not a talking point. It is strategic breathing room. It allows Canada to keep trading while quietly adjusting its long-term posture. More importantly, Canada is no longer pretending that preferential access to the U.S. market is a permanent guarantee. The language coming from Ottawa has shifted. The focus is no longer on dependence, but on durability, not on proximity, but on options. This is not anti-American, it is pro-Canadian.
Champagne did not downplay the damage caused by tariffs. He spoke directly about workers who feel the impact most sharply. Steel workers in Hamilton, auto workers in Oshawa, forestry communities, farmers and fishers across the country. The pain is real and it is uneven. Tariffs hit specific sectors harder than others, even when those sectors are deeply integrated into U.S. supply chains. That is the paradox of Trump's trade policy. It claims to protect American industry while actively disrupting the North American production system that keeps those industries competitive. Canada is not denying that reality. Unlike Washington, Ottawa is not pretending tariffs are painless or temporary. The government has focused on targeted support for affected industries while accelerating structural changes that reduce exposure to future shocks. That includes strengthening domestic supply chains, investing in advanced manufacturing, securing critical minerals, and positioning Canada as a stable energy and technology partner in a volatile global economy. These are not short-term fixes, they are long-term insurance policies. One of the most revealing moments in Champagne's remarks had little to do with the United States directly. He pointed to growing international interest in Canada from Europe, Asia, and the Middle East. Countries and investors are seeking stability, predictability, and rule of law at a time when global uncertainty is higher than it was during the 2008 financial crisis. Canada is benefiting from that contrast. While Washington debates tariffs and threats, Canada is hosting G7 meetings, deepening economic and security ties with allies, and attracting investment precisely because it does not govern by impulse. In a world where trade is increasingly linked to national security and political alignment, Canada's reputation matters. Trump's America sells leverage and confrontation. Canada sells consistency and credibility. That difference is quietly reshaping how global partners view North America. There is no illusion in Ottawa about what lies ahead. The 2026 USMA review will be contentious. Washington may threaten withdrawal. Tariffs may resurface as negotiating tools. Public pressure campaigns will intensify. But Canada enters that process more prepared than it was during Trump's first term. It has diversified trade relationships, it has reinforced domestic resilience, and it has learned that reacting emotionally to U.S. pressure only strengthens it. Experience has replaced anxiety. Champagne's tone reflected that confidence. Canada will continue to engage the United States. It will continue to defend its interests, but it will no longer assume that stability automatically flows from proximity. The relationship is evolving whether Washington likes it or not. There's a quieter shift happening beneath Washington's noise. Every time U.S. trade policy swings with politics, Canada gains something valuable: credibility. Global partners and investors respond to stability, not volume. Canada is positioning itself as a reliable anchor in areas where uncertainty now carries real costs, from energy security and critical minerals to advanced manufacturing and artificial intelligence. These are not talking points, they are active conversations with allies who want supply chains that survive political cycles. Champagne's focus on controlling what Canada can control reflects that reality. As Canada removes internal trade barriers, strengthens domestic production, and deepens markets beyond the United States, its leverage improves naturally, not through confrontation, but through options. The United States remains Canada's largest trading partner, but it is no longer the only pillar supporting Canada's economic future. That changes the tone of every negotiation heading into the USMA review. When alternatives exist, pressure loses its edge.
Donald Trump believes pressure forces compliance. Canada is demonstrating something else entirely. Pressure forces adaptation. Cosmic hawks may still be ongoing, but Canada's economic future is no longer hostage to American mood swings. If the United States wants a stable, integrated North American economy, Canada remains a willing partner. If not, Canada is already building alternatives. As 2026 approaches, the real question is not whether Canada is ready. It is whether Washington understands that the leverage it once relied on is quietly slipping away, because this time Canada is not flinching.
The president got mad about an ad. Canada wants to insert itself and create a new precedent that you're going to participate in our electoral politics through advertising targeting the President of the United States and his policies. I would suggest that you seriously consider whether that is the best way to try to achieve your objectives in the United States of America.
Canada just pulled off something extraordinary, and Washington accidentally admitted it. In a moment that stunned political observers, U.S. Ambassador Pete Hoekstra revealed that Canada had struck directly at Donald Trump's political weak spot. A single advertising campaign from Ontario rattled Trump deeply enough that his own ambassador stepped in front of cameras and told Canada, almost pleadingly, "Don't ever do that again." This wasn't a diplomatic warning. It was a confession, and it tells us everything about where the power actually lies in today's Canada-US standoff.
The scene was the Canadian Manufacturers and Exporters Conference, where Hoekstra addressed questions about the ongoing breakdown in Canada-US trade talks. The relationship has already been frayed by months of tariff escalation. President Donald Trump, now in his second term, has doubled down on his America First economic playbook. He has used emergency tariff powers to impose sweeping 25% duties on most Canadian goods and a 10% tariff on Canadian energy. These moves have strained supply chains, pushed up prices, and forced Canadian industries into defensive mode. Prime Minister Mark Carney, newly elected at the start of 2025, has responded strategically. He launched a $38.9 billion counter-tariff package, expanded export ties toward Asia, and framed the current era as Canada's chance to break free from economic overdependence on the United States. But the conversation shifted dramatically when Hoekstra was asked if stalled trade talks could resume. Instead of offering reassurance or a diplomatic reset, he lashed out at Ontario's decision to run anti-tariff ads in U.S. states. The ads highlighted how Trump's tariffs were hurting American workers and raising consumer prices. Hoekstra insisted this had never happened before in the history of the United States. He warned Canada not to repeat it. And that is when the panel discussion that followed revealed the truth. Canada had hit Trump exactly where he is the most vulnerable, in front of his own voters.
When a U.S. ambassador tells Canada to stop doing something and says it twice, it means Canada found leverage. Hoekstra could have brushed off the ads as inconsequential. Instead, he treated them like an act of war. His warning wasn't about election integrity or diplomatic norms. It was about fear. Fear that Canada had tapped into Trump's political insecurity. Analysts on CBC News put it plainly. The moment you take your case directly to Republican voters, you hit Trump's weak spot. That line says everything. Trump can shrug off diplomatic protests. He can ignore closed-door complaints, but he cannot ignore the voters who hold his political future in their hands. By bypassing Washington and talking directly to the American people, Canada disrupted his carefully controlled narrative. Hoekstra's outrage shows that Trump wasn't just annoyed, he felt threatened.
You did that, you've got not only Trump, but you've got his spokespeople in other countries saying, don't ever do that again. And that, to me, suggests a weak spot within MAGA, and another reason why the ads were good, because he doesn't also accept weakness.
For decades, Canada avoided confronting the United States publicly, even during moments of intense disagreement. Ottawa traditionally preferred quiet negotiations, back-channel diplomacy, and deliberately low-profile pushback. But this time, Canada chose visibility. Ontario's ads didn't whisper, they shouted. They told American workers that Trump's tariffs were destroying their jobs, raising their costs, and hurting their farms and factories. The U.S. could live with Canada complaining to diplomats. What it could not tolerate was Canada going over its head and speaking directly to American voters. Ottawa sent a message. Canada isn't a 51st state. Canada isn't afraid. Canada is willing to fight where it counts. Hoekstra's reaction revealed the scale of that impact. He behaved less like a diplomat and more like someone caught off guard, frustrated, and scrambling to contain political damage. It was not the response of a confident superpower. It was the response of a government that realized Canada had found a pressure point.
Hoekstra also claimed that Canada should aim to join the lowest tariff bucket, pointing to the 10% tariff baseline in the recent US-UK trade arrangement. He presented this as the best Canada could hope for. But experts on the panel immediately clarified that this was not a prize, it was a trap. Even the UK is unhappy with its deal, and several countries that signed early agreements with Washington have publicly expressed regret. A 10% tariff may sound modest, but it excludes critical sectors like steel, aluminum, autos, and lumber, the very industries that shape Canada's economic identity. This is why Carney's government is refusing to rush. Ottawa is waiting for the U.S. Supreme Court's ruling on Trump's tariff powers, waiting to see how Congress reacts, and waiting to determine whether Trump's policies can withstand pressure from his own voters and business leaders. Canada has no reason to sign a deal on Trump's timeline. The longer Canada waits, the more leverage it gains.
Observers noted that Hoekstra did not speak like a calm diplomat representing a stable administration. Instead, he sounded irritated and emotional. Analysts compared him to the cranky uncle, the opposite of what the U.S. usually sends to Ottawa. During previous diplomatic tensions, including the lead-up to the Iraq War under George W. Bush, ambassadors never displayed this level of frustration publicly. So why now? Why this tone? Why this imbalance? Because this time, the United States is under pressure. Trump's tariff war has raised consumer prices, rattled markets, upset farmers, and sparked internal Republican backlash. Canada's decision to expose these weaknesses through targeted ads magnified that internal pressure. Hoekstra's frustration is a sign not of strength, but of strain. As one analyst said during the panel, Trump respects strength, he doesn't respect weakness. Canada finally displayed strength, and Washington reacted exactly as you'd expect when confronted with something it doesn't control.
The Canada of today is not the Canada of a decade ago. Under Mark Carney's leadership, Canada has developed a clearer, more strategic foreign policy, one defined by independence, diversification, and self-confidence. Carney has framed the current moment as the end of an era of quiet dependence on American markets. Instead of simply pleading for tariff relief, Canada is expanding its economic relationships in Asia, deepening ties with South Korea and Japan, and positioning itself as a clean energy superpower. Hoekstra's reaction signals that this shift is being noticed. Washington realizes Canada is no longer playing a supporting role, and Trump's team knows that Canada has discovered a new tool, one that hits them exactly where it hurts most.
Pete Hoekstra didn't mean to reveal anything, but he revealed more than any official briefing or press conference could. He confirmed that Canada has leverage over Trump. He confirmed the targeted political messaging worked. And he confirmed that Washington is nervous about Canada using that strategy again. The question now is simple. Will Canada continue to press that weak spot, or will it back away just when the strategy is beginning to reshape the dynamic between Ottawa and Washington? Canada now knows where the pressure point is, and the world is watching to see whether it chooses to apply that pressure again.
We don't need their oil and gas. We have more than anybody.
Trump rejected the need for Canada's oil and gas, saying the U.S. has, quote, more than anybody.
Donald Trump insists the United States doesn't need Canadian oil. But this time, that claim runs into a Canada that has just rewritten its entire energy playbook. In his new federal budget, Prime Minister Mark Carney introduced aggressive clean energy incentives that are reshaping how Canada produces, transports, and exports power. Canada is no longer merely reacting to American pressure, it is positioning itself as an energy superpower with options across oil, electricity, and emerging clean technologies.
Champagne's message comes as talks between Ottawa and Alberta over oil and gas caps, pipelines, and tanker policy edge towards a possible deal. Last week, Danielle Smith was all smiles meeting Carney, and on her weekend radio show, she hinted a deal.
So when Trump escalates tariffs across the continent, he's stepping directly into his biggest vulnerability. American refineries cannot operate without Canadian crude. And Canada now holds more leverage than at any moment in modern North American energy history. Throughout 2025, the Trump administration expanded its 25% tariff wall on nearly every Canadian product. Autos, metals, agricultural goods, and processed foods all landed in Washington's crosshairs. Yet one sector kept escaping the hammer: Alberta oil. Trump threatened a 10% levy early in the year but never followed through, and the reason is obvious. Instead of declining under tariffs, U.S. imports of Canadian crude have risen to record levels. According to newly released EIA data, Canada now supplies close to 68% of all U.S. crude imports, between 4 and 4.5 million barrels per day. It is the highest level of dependence the U.S. has ever had on a single foreign supplier. This comes as Canada fundamentally alters its export structure. The Trans Mountain Expansion Pipeline is fully operational, allowing Alberta crude to reach Asia directly through the Pacific. Exports to foreign markets jumped from 80,000 barrels a day to nearly 400,000 in less than a year. For the first time, the U.S. is not Canada's only energy outlet. Carney's budget amplifies this shift. It confirms major clean energy tax credits, deep investments in nuclear and hydropowered transmission, and a super productivity deduction that accelerates energy sector expansion. Far from being cornered by tariffs, Canada is re-engineering its energy system for a future where it does not rely on U.S. policy stability.
Canada is the world's fourth largest oil producer, but 98% of its crude is shipped to the U.S. We relied on the other. Nearly all of Canada's oil is exported to its neighbor, and that oil makes up 60% of U.S. imports.
The United States may produce a tremendous amount of oil, but it cannot operate its refining system without Canadian heavy crude. This is not political rhetoric, it is structural. Decades ago, U.S. refineries in the Midwest and along the Gulf Coast spent billions building specialized equipment to process Alberta's heavy sulfur-rich blend. Most of these refineries cannot simply switch to lighter U.S. shale oil without major losses in efficiency or outright shutdowns. EIA petroleum economist Jeff Barron confirmed this reality in a 2025 interview. Roughly 70% of U.S. refining capacity built for heavy crude is purpose-designed for Canada's product. Even in the smaller portion of refineries that could theoretically adjust their slate, very few have done so. They continue to buy Canadian barrels because they work and because global alternatives have dried up. Venezuela's exports have collapsed. Mexico is diverting production to domestic refining. And Saudi Arabia, along with other OPEC states, has tightened medium-heavy supplies. In this environment, Canada has become the indispensable supplier of the exact grade American refineries are engineered to run. For all of Trump's political bravado, the United States cannot replace this feedstock quickly or cheaply. The system itself depends on it. For decades, Ottawa worried about being overly tied to the U.S. market. Alberta producers endured heavy discounts and limited export options. TMX fundamentally changed that. By adding nearly 900,000 barrels per day of new capacity, Canada now has a genuine gateway to global markets. Tankers leaving the West Coast can serve Asia directly, allowing Canada to diversify buyers and reduce vulnerability to U.S. policy swings. Exports to China, Japan, and South Korea have already increased significantly. The presence of new global buyers also narrows the pricing gap between Western Canadian Select and world benchmarks. More importantly, it gives Canada the ability, at least partially, to redirect barrels during a political confrontation. That single shift in leverage was unthinkable a decade ago. Carney's budget reinforces this transformation by treating energy as a national strategic asset rather than a regional commodity. His government reaffirmed large-scale clean energy tax credits, expanded nuclear financing mechanisms, and activated a super-productivity deduction that rewards companies for building energy infrastructure quickly. Carney also emphasized strengthening interprovincial electricity connections, particularly linking New Brunswick, Quebec, and Nova Scotia into a cleaner, more integrated grid. This effort gives Canada the dual advantage of scaling clean power domestically while increasing opportunities to export electricity to the United States, especially into manufacturing in AI-heavy regions that have seen rapid demand growth. Taken together, these initiatives show a Canada preparing not just to survive U.S. tariffs, but to reshape its long-term bargaining power. The country is moving toward an energy corridor model that blends oil, natural gas, hydrogen, and clean electricity into one national strategy. Canada ever chose to respond to U.S. tariffs using energy, the repercussions in America would be immediate. Gasoline prices would climb, especially across the Midwest, where refinery systems are deeply dependent on Alberta's heavy crude. Facilities optimized for Canadian feedstock would face lower yields and higher costs. Some could be forced into temporary slowdowns. The ripple effects would move quickly through the economy. Transportation costs would rise, manufacturing margins would tighten, food prices would feel the shock, inflation, already volatile, would edge upward, and the political consequences for Trump in industrial swing states would be difficult to ignore. Michigan, Ohio, Wisconsin, and Pennsylvania all rely on low-cost fuel and stable refinery employment. And the challenge does not end with oil. The United States imports more than 30 terawatt-hours of Canadian electricity each year. That power supports sectors ranging from auto manufacturing to defense supply chains to AI data centers. Any disturbance in this flow would aggravate the same states Trump needs most. Trump can threaten tariffs, demand concessions, or declare that America can stand alone. But the U.S. energy system tells a different story, one much harder to bend to political messaging. America runs on Canadian oil, and the technical backbone of its refineries leaves it with little alternative. Meanwhile, Canada's new export routes, diversified buyers, and Carney's energy-heavy budget place the country in a stronger strategic position than at any point in the past generation. What used to be a one-way dependence is becoming a two-way constraint, with Canada increasingly able to choose how it participates. The real question now is simple. In a future defined by energy security, who has more to lose? The country building stability and options, or the one betting everything on tariffs?